Hi, and welcome back. In this video, we're going to install the electronics into this frame. This is the brand new Echo 5 from OddityRC. I've already built and reviewed this frame in a previous video, and now it's time to finish the build. To bring this frame to life, I've gone with a pretty standard freestyle setup, making it an easy build to follow along with if you're planning to build your own quad. The total cost of this build is about $450 US. I'll include affiliate links to everything I'm using down in the video description, and I'd really appreciate it if you choose to support me by using them. The first thing I always start with when building a drone is the motors. This time I've gone with the Meps Neon Cool motors. They're 23mm wide, 6mm tall, and have a kV rating of 1950. That should make this quad quite powerful. The Echo 5 frame, which is the main character here, has a lot of smart design features. One of them is the motor protection. It's made from TPU, but the print quality is really solid. It's also designed so the motor screws don't press directly against the TPU, which is a common issue on many other frames. Before we can mount the motors, we need to figure out the correct screw length to use. This frame has 5.5mm thick arms, so an 8mm screw length should be perfect, without the screws reaching into the motor windings. That's something you should always double check before getting started. Before I mount the motors, I always add a small dab of blue Loctite to the screws, especially if the motor screws don't come with any thread locker from the factory. Just be careful not to get any on the TPU, since Loctite will dissolve and destroy it. When mounting the motors, start by loosely fitting all the screws. Don't fully tighten the first one right away. That way, it's much easier to get all 4 screws in place before tightening everything down. When tightening the screws, you do want to apply some pressure. Tighten them until they stop and then just a little bit more, but be careful not to snap the screw, because removing a broken one is not a fun job. So the next thing you need to think about is how to protect the motor wires. There are a lot of different ways to do it. Some people just use electrical tape and secure them to the arms. If you've seen my previous videos, you know I like to use PET braided sleeve to keep them in place. But this frame comes with cable ducts included, so since OddityRC sent me this frame for free, I'm going to stick as closely as possible to the solutions they've designed without customizing it too much. At the same time, that should make this video easy to follow if you want to replicate the build yourself. The cable ducts come with double-sided tape. You just peel it off and stick them straight onto the arm. Make sure they're lined up properly before pushing them down. Now I'm going to repeat the same process on the other 3 motors, but to avoid boring you to death, we'll skip ahead and move on to the next step. That's mounting the ESC, which stands for Electronic Speed Controller. The ESC I've chosen is also from Meps. This is their brand new Neon Core 60 amp 4-in-1 ESC, and it's part of their Neon Core stack. I'll be doing a dedicated review of this stack soon, but my first impressions are very positive. I went with a slightly powerful 60 amp for this build, since the 1950 kV motors are on the higher side and will likely pull a fair amount of current. I like to prep the ESC by quickly pre-tinning all the pads before installing it. The soldering iron I'm using is the TS101. It's a solid little iron that heats up fast. I'll leave a link to it in the description if you want to check it out. Before I actually start installing the ESC and soldering the motor wires, there's another thing I want to get in place first. I want to get the air unit and camera in place so I can route the camera cable underneath the ESC. It's just a lot easier to lay it in place now than trying to feed it under the ESC later. The air unit I'm installing is Flywoo's modified O4 Lite unit. This has pretty much become my go-to option for 5-inch builds lately. It costs about half as much as the Pro version, and with Flywoo's wide lens, it's more than capable for a 5-inch, especially if you're running an action camera as well. The air unit mounts directly to the 25 by 25mm holes at the rear of the frame. To secure it, you use 4 M2 screws that are 6mm long, which are included. This frame comes with 2 different camera mounts. It's a bit hard to see here, but one is made of TPU and the other is silicone. For the O4, I'm using the silicone one. You press the silicone mounts in from the inside, one on each side. When it comes to the camera, make sure you install it the right way. On these Flywoo kits, the cable should be facing upwards. I'll wait until the end before placing the camera screws, just in case I need to take the camera out again. Anyways, now I can neatly lay the camera cable in place before installing the ESC. The capacitor that comes with the ESC is a 35V 470 microfarad wet electrolytic capacitor. Honestly, I think they should have included a better one. I'm going with this 35V 1000 microfarad polymer capacitor instead. It's significantly better, and it's the same physical size. On this frame, there's a dedicated spot for the capacitor under the stack, so I like to add some heat shrink around it. That way it gets a tight fit and stays securely in place. Since the capacitor sits down in the slot under the stack, the legs need to be bent slightly. I use some school gum to hold it in place while I solder it. Next up is sorting out the motor wires and cutting them to the right length. Since this frame has side plates, the wires need to be solid from the side so they don't rub against the frame. When cutting the motor wires, it's a good idea to take a second or two to make sure they're long enough. After that, strip just enough insulation so the exposed wire covers the pad you're going to solder it to. Then finally, pre-tin the wires so they're ready to be soldered to the ESC. When soldering the motor wires, take your time and use a bit of flux if the solder starts getting sticky. It's important that these wires are properly secured. If they come loose in flight, the drone will drop out of the air. To clean off the flux, I use isopropyl alcohol and an old toothbrush. The flux I'm using is no clean, which means it's non-conductive, but it's still a good idea to remove any residue. Now it's time to start thinking about the XT60 wires, but before we can do that, we need to mount the TPU part that holds the antennas and the XT60 connector. This frame comes with a full TPU kit, but the included one is designed for the O4 Pro and has mounts for 2 VTX antennas, while I only need one. Luckily, OddityRC has made all the STL files available on their website. You can download the full kit there, including a separate mount for a single antenna. I downloaded it and printed it out, but I ended up making a small modification to the mount, since the holes for the ELRS antenna were too large. As you can see here, I upload all my STL files to my Maker World profile, so if you're interested, you can find them there. To get the antenna into the mount, we need to temporarily disconnect it from the VTX so we can feed the antenna cable through the mount. Just be aware of the thermal paste that Flywoo has applied here, so you don't make too much of a mess. You can easily disconnect the antenna by unplugging the UFL connector. Then just feed the wire through the hole and push the antenna down as far as it will go. Reconnect the antenna cable and make sure it's properly seated. Before I put the Flywoo cover back on, I like to secure the camera cable a bit extra since it has a reputation for coming loose. For that, I use a small dab of T8000 glue, which is perfect for this kind of thing. With the frame, you get 2 pieces of 12 gauge wire and an XT60 female connector. The wires need to be soldered to the connector, and the connector is then mounted inside the TPU part. To make the soldering a bit easier, twist the pins on the connector so they sit flat. That makes it easier to position the wires. Soldering 12 gauge wires requires quite a bit of heat. To prevent the XT60 connector from melting, plug in an old smoke stopper or something similar to help dissipate the heat. Pre-tin the connector first, then let it cool down for a bit while you strip about 3 mm of insulation from the wires. Pre-tin the wires thoroughly, but don't saturate the entire wire with solder, as that will make it stiff and difficult to work with. Instead, turn the wire around and add more solder from the other side. Make sure you have the correct wire going to the correct pin. The round side of the connector is ground, so remember, round is ground, or negative as it's technically called, but then it doesn't rhyme. A good way to check that they're securely attached is to pull them out of the smoke stopper by the wires. Finish off by adding some heat shrink around them. Now that the wires are ready, we can figure out the correct length to the ESC. To do that, we'll mount the connector in the TPU mount first. Since the XT60 wires will run over the air unit, it got me thinking about what else needs to go there, the ELRS receiver. So we'll install that first, so we don't have to deal with it after the XT60 wires are in place. Starting with the ELRS antenna, this is a single 2.4 GHz antenna. For this build, I've chosen a Radiomaster RP1 ExpressLRS receiver. On a simple freestyle quad like this, you don't really need diversity or 2 antennas. In my opinion, the range is still more than enough. With the Echo 5 frame, you get a TPU mount for the receiver that fits directly on top of the air unit. But before we mount it, we need to solder the wires first, pre-tin the pads to make the process easier. Try to remember which color you use for RX and TX, since you'll need to know that later in the process and it can be hard to see on the receiver afterward. To mount the receiver bracket, just use the existing screws from the air unit and secure it on top. Now the receiver is in place and we're finally ready to solder on the XT60 wires. I don't think I've ever waited this long in a build before doing that. Usually it's one of the first things you do after the motors, but sometimes it just works out this way and is a good reminder to think a few steps ahead when building a quad. One thing I like to do, if I have the space for it, is to use a few nylon nuts between the ESC and the flight controller. That way I avoid the ESC putting upward pressure on the flight controller due to the tension from both the XT60 wires and the motor wires. Now it's time to cut the XT60 wires to the correct length. It might go without saying, but it's important to get this right as well. It's better to leave them a couple of millimeters too long rather than too short. Sorry for the awkward camera angle. It's not always easy to get the right shots when I'm filming with my iPhone. If you have any tips for a good camera and tripod for this kind of filming, feel free to drop a comment. Anyway, both XT60 wires are now soldered in place. To finish it off, I add a bit of T8000 glue here as well to insulate them, just to be on the safe side. Now we've made some solid progress with the build and it's starting to come together. There are 3 things left to install: the flight controller, the beeper, and the GPS. The flight controller I'm using is the Meps NeonCore F405. It's part of the NeonCore stack and is a brand new flight controller. It runs an F4 processor with an ICM gyro, and it has direct support for DJI along with all the UARTs you need. This will also be part of my upcoming review of the NeonCore stack. To connect the flight controller to the ESC, use the custom cable that comes with the flight controller. This FC supports up to 8 motors through the ESC port, but the included cable is configured for 4, which is exactly what we need here. Twist the cable a few times to make it a bit stiffer, and then I like to add some cloth tape. It doesn't really serve any purpose other than making it look a bit cleaner. On flight controllers like this, where the ports are located on the underside, always make sure there's enough clearance between the FC and the ESC. If the ports are resting against the ESC, it defeats the purpose of the soft mounting and can transfer vibrations. It's time to connect the air unit to the flight controller. Here, I'm just using a standard DJI cable that comes with the Flywoo kit. I've only removed the yellow S-bus wire and added some heat shrink. Be aware that the DJI port on this flight controller isn't completely standard. It includes a video out pin, so make sure your plug is connected the way I'm showing here in the video, starting from the S-bus pin and working across. Now that I don't need to remove the flight controller anymore, it's time to secure it. For that, I'm using the 4 nylon nuts that are included. The flight controller should be secured firmly, but not so tight that the rubber grommets are overly compressed. You should still be able to press it down slightly and feel some damping. Next up is the receiver. Even though this flight controller has ports I could use, I prefer to solder the wires directly. That way I can cut them to the exact length I need and it gives me a much cleaner build. This flight controller has plenty of UARTs. I'm planning to solder the receiver to UART 3, the GPS to UART 4, and the air unit on the DJI port uses UART 1. One thing I really like about this flight controller is that the pads are a good size and easy to solder to. The only downside is that there's just a single 5-volt pad powered by USB. It would have been nice to power both the GPS and the receiver when the drone is plugged in on the bench. Now it's time to remember which color I used for RX and TX on the receiver. I used green for RX on the receiver, which means the green wire goes to TX on the flight controller. It's always a good idea to stick to a standard like this, so you don't have to second guess it later. The frame comes with a small beeper and a TPU mount for it. There's a dedicated spot behind the camera. This is the version without a built-in battery, but there's enough room to fit one with a built-in battery as well. They're really useful if the main battery gets disconnected, for example in a crash. You'll need to solder 2 wires to the beeper. It's marked with positive and negative pins, so make sure you remember which wire is which. Since the buzzer pad on the flight controller is located at the back, I'm routing the buzzer wires underneath the stack so they don't run across the top of the FC. On this flight controller, the negative wire from the buzzer should be soldered to the BZ pad. I actually make a mistake here and solder BZ plus to the buzzer pad and BZ minus to a ground pad, which won't work. I fixed it afterwards, but forgot to film it, so just a little heads up to make things clear. The positive wire from the buzzer goes to 5 volts and the negative wire goes to the BZ pad. The last thing we need to install is the GPS. I usually prefer to mount the GPS at the front on top of a 5-inch, but since I want to be able to run a GoPro on this quad, we're going to mount it at the back instead. That's also where OddityRC designed it to go. But the GPS mount that comes with the frame is basically useless. It's designed for a mini GPS, and if you want to get any real benefit from having GPS on a 5-inch, I'd recommend using a full-size GPS instead. My preferred GPS is the HGL-RCM 100 module. It's one of the best GPS modules I've tried lately, and it's also very affordable. So to mount it on the Echo 5 frame, I had to design and 3D print a custom mount that fits. I took the mounting part from OddityRC's original mount and recreated the same mounting pattern on my own mount for the M100 GPS module. I designed it in Fusion 360, and I'll also upload the STL file to my Maker World profile if you need it for your own build. The new mount came out really nice, and it fits directly onto the original mount. For the GPS to work as well as possible, you want to keep it as far away as possible from the VTX antenna and other sources of electrical noise, so placing it right at the back is actually one of the worst locations on the whole frame. But to give it the best possible conditions, I'm going to use a shielded GPS cable running from the GPS to the flight controller. To make a shielded cable, I'm using a copper tape and wrapping it around the cable. Then I cover it with cloth tape for insulation. I'm also soldering a wire from the copper shielding to a ground pad on the flight controller. I start by removing the 2 wires on the cable that are used for the compass. The magnetometer is very difficult to calibrate properly on a small drone like this, and in the latest version of Beta Flight, both return to home and position hold work really well using GPS alone. It's also an advantage to use a cable that's as thin as possible when we're shielding it like this. I measure the cable first, so I know roughly how long it needs to be before cutting off one of the connectors. I try to keep the shielding as thin as possible because the cable gets stiff very quickly and becomes difficult to work with. I wrap a thin layer of copper tape as evenly as possible around the entire cable. For the shielding to work, we need to ground it to a ground pad, so it's a good idea to solder the ground wire on now before adding the cloth tape. Now the cable is ready and it's not too stiff either, so all that's left is to route it into place and secure the GPS with the included M3 screw and lock nut. When soldering the GPS, I start by soldering the ground wire from the shielding to an unused ground pad on the flight controller. The rest is pretty straightforward. TX on the GPS goes to RX on the flight controller and vice versa. Now, the drone is basically finished, and I'm pretty happy with how it's turned out so far. I still need to secure the camera, since I left that until the end. I'm using 4 1.5mm screws that come with the Flywoo kit. This frame was just released in July, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be well received by the FPV community. It has plenty of space for building, even though it's a 5-inch frame, and from what I've flown it so far, I'm really impressed. I'll show you some flight footage towards the end of the video. One thing about this frame is that it has a feature called side plates. The side plates do look really cool and add some protection for the electronics, but they can get in the way of the USB port. To solve this, OddityRC includes this USB extension port, but it does require that your flight controller has dedicated pads for a USB port, which the one I'm using doesn't have. So my solution here is to use this USB male adapter I had lying around. I solder it to the cable that comes with the frame, and that way I can also disconnect it later so I can remove the top plate if needed. In my opinion, every frame that relies on having the USB port mounted to the top plate or somewhere else on the frame should just include a cable like this. Not all flight controllers have pads for an external USB port, and being able to disconnect the cable makes maintenance on the drone much easier. So OddityRC, hear me out. The side plates slide down onto the 3 standoffs on each side, and as you can see, there's still plenty of room even with a USB cable like this installed. And finally, the drone is fully built. I'm really happy with how OddityRC has designed this frame, despite my little USB rant earlier, and I think the Meps motors and stack make a great match for it. A big thanks to both OddityRC and Meps for sending me these products to test. Now let's put some propellers on it and see how it looks fully ready to fly. These are the Gemfan Vanistyle 5136 props, and they come in a really nice matching color. You also get 2 battery straps, which seem to be good quality. They're made with Kevlar, rather than the cheap type where the plastic coating starts peeling off after a while. And I've got to say, this is a really nice looking drone. Now let's quickly see how it flies. First of all, this frame has no bad vibrations, and the new Meps stack delivers a really clean gyro signal. Combined with the GPS getting plenty of satellites, the latest version of Betaflight gives me a really stable position hold. I want to point out that this is literally my first pack on this drone before doing any tuning, so here I'm flying with the default Betaflight PIDs. Honestly, the default Betaflight settings have gotten so good that as long as it's a 5-inch, you really don't need much tuning anymore. So, the drone flies really well. I'm getting a lot of power from these 2306 motors, and there's absolutely no jello in the O4 camera footage. I was pretty lucky with the weather on this day, so I managed to get quite a few packs in, and after flying it for a while, I quickly became very confident with this drone. So if I were a complete beginner today, I could definitely see this build being a great place to start. Of course, I can't say much about the durability yet, since I took it fairly easy and didn't exactly smash it into a brick wall. But considering the total price of around $450 US, I think this is a really good value for money for a drone like this these days. So that brings us to the end of this build video. Thanks for watching. I was actually planning to include the Betaflight setup and tuning process in this video as well, but it's already getting way too long. So if you're interested in seeing that in another video or checking out some of my other stuff, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.